Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. My guest tonight, returning for a second visit, is Dr. David Deavel, Associate Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Did you get some snow?
We did. So it was, I guess, the largest snowfall in 20 years in the Houston area. So,
and the largest snowfall in 20 years in Houston amounts to how much exactly?
Yeah, 4 inches maybe.
Oh, 4 inches.
Like
That's substantial.
It was, so it wasn't bad. Depended on where you were. Some places were more like 2 or 3. Some places were more like 4 or 5. So, but it was pretty huge.
How long was it on the ground?
It's still on the ground. It came down in the middle of the night 2 nights ago, and we still have it, although some of it's melted. So most of Houston canceled school and work for yesterday and today, but people are going back tomorrow. So
I see. Well, we wanted to get together and do sort of a episode talking about, sparked by a tweet that I wrote this week, where I said that Andrew Tate was not popular because he speaks out for young men who are oppressed by the Longhouse, but rather he's popular because he gives them permission and gives them license to indulge their most basic and primal urges. This became sort of controversial, and lots of people disagreed with me, or at least wanted to modify my position. And I think you wanted to say something about that. So do you disagree with what I said there?
Slightly. I mean, I get for I didn't. I think this came up in the context of Benny Johnson, a kind of Trumpy influencer who had him on his show.
Yes.
And a couple of other people. I think Tucker Carlson had him on once last year or something like that too. And in both cases, many people said, well, we really don't need him. So I kind of disagree with you insofar as Tate is a distortion of true masculinity, but his popularity, I think, is due in part to, if not the Longhouse necessarily, although in some cases that, it is a kind of modified, weakened version of Christian approaches to masculinity. And so people are reacting to what is completely weak on one side, and they're going whole hog with the other. But I do agree with you that the fact that his version of masculinity is kind of an unbridled vision of what masculinity is, unbridled even by natural law or by goodness. That we're fallen creatures, so that does help sell it.
Right, and I think so. Let me refine the argument beyond the tweet.
Yeah,
that we have already lots of examples of healthy masculinity in the culture, certainly in Christian circles. Okay. Jordan Peterson is a good example. Even, someone less well known, I think of like Matt Fradd, who's a very open Christian, a good man. Michael Knowles, he's a good example. Okay. Mm-hmm. None of these guys even come close to approaching Tate's popularity. So then the question becomes, what is different about Tate that accounts for the gap in his popularity so far beyond the popularity of male social media personalities who are also good examples for young men? So what accounts for that discrepancy? And my argument is what counts for that discrepancy is that those 3 guys I just mentioned all tell young men to pursue virtue, and Tate tells them how to be a pimp.
That could, yeah.
Yeah.
I do think, though, I mean, I think there's something true to that. But I mean, one thing modify is in certain ways, many Christian influencers until recently have been very angry that Jordan Peterson is considered an influencer in this regard because I mean, I don't know where he is today. His wife certainly has embraced Christian faith. She entered the Catholic Church this last year. And takes him around. I mean, one of my students said his brother, who's at a monastery, had a surprise visit from the Petersons. But to my knowledge, Peterson himself has not professed Christianity yet. And part of the reason why he was controversial is because he also embraced a notion of masculinity that included aggression and confrontation and things like that. So he was considered out there by many and has been rejected by many. I do think that you're right that Tate encouraging them to have a kind of a domination is popular for that reason, but his is also an extreme confrontational view of what masculinity is. And it's a distortion, but I think that there's still, even in the Christian world, there's a kind of reticence about being too aggressive or being confrontational or even to a certain extent, there's pressure that people like Peterson were reacting to about being confrontational and logical thinking, because that's often been perceived as a distortion of what it means to be human. So I think that Tate, again, is a horrible individual, but he is straightforward in his aggression and his sort of embrace of power, and that's why I think young men are attracted to it, even though I think it's dangerous and indeed bad.
The other argument that came my way is that actually what is at heart of Tate's popularity is feminism, and that by embracing Tate, young men sort of declare independence from feminism, which has oppressed them in some way. Okay.
Yeah.
And, I think just part of being a reasonable person is being willing to reflect on the truisms that are on your own side. Okay. And the notion that young men are rebelling against an oppressive kind of feminism is a truism on the right that I think at the very least is worth reflecting on. So and I think, and see what you think about this. You and I have both been teachers for a long time. Yeah. And when I go to class and I say, who here is ready to do your presentation? 3 hands out of 20 will go up. They will all be girls. Their presentations will be almost like professional level because they will have really polished them and cared and tried. Almost universally, none of the boys will do that well. And it's because they, instead of working on their presentation, went home and played PlayStation soccer. And this is, and I've taught for 20 years, and this has been the case the whole time, is that in the classroom, the boys simply do not make the effort that the girls make.
Yeah.
And it's unclear to me how feminism is responsible for the boys choosing to play video games instead of do their homework.
Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly an example of it. Although it does testify, I think, to a particularly male pattern of not, in many cases, not. I think boys, just generally speaking, aren't as obedient as girls are.
Yes, I think that's part of it. Yep.
And they don't like to be told, well, we're going to do this, this, and this. So I don't know if that particularly is a response to feminism. Although if it is, it's part of the what I see among some young men as the sort of like, well, who really cares how well I do, because I'm going to be discriminated against in terms of scholarships and the job market and everything else. Because we all know that, at least, up until, I don't know, maybe I haven't read all the executive orders. I know that
right.
Discrimination on the basis of race is out, but there's still a kind of we still have Take Your Daughter to Work Day and celebrating women and You Go Girl. And men are, despite the fact that they're, very much needed, are still being told at important levels that ultimately, you're not, whatever you do, it's not going to be enough, because we're always going to look, to other people, namely women. So I wonder if that's, at least a part of this increasing sort of reluctance to get in the game.
So let me say two things to argue with even myself here with my last.
Sure.
So it seems to me that none of these boys in my whole teaching career have ever, they're not reading the First Things article about the Longhouse. They never heard First Things. Some of them don't even know who Andrew Tate is, or if they do, they barely do. Right?
Yeah.
That they are in fact acting out their own script. But if we want to say that feminism has hurt them, and here is how, in my experience as a teacher, how that may be true. That when I look at these boys and I think, what do they really need? What they really need is single sex education.
Yeah.
Because I think I am so much easier on them because the girls are in the class. Like, I have to teach the class.
Yeah.
And if I had the policies and attitude that I would have if it were only the boys in the class, in a mixed class, it wouldn't fly. So I'm like really much more gentle and open and easygoing because the young women are there. If it were only the boys, it would be, you're either doing, you didn't do your homework, you failed, and you fail every day, and then you're gone. Right. And someone asked me on Twitter about, like, well, what's your solution? And I said, really, I think single sex education at least for the boys, most of the time, should be the case, because they just need so much more pressure and so much more. They need a teacher who is willing to fight them.
That's right.
And it's really hard as a teacher to be that, because you can't fight, as a male teacher, you can't fight the girls.
Right.
And the women in the class, like you were saying, have so much higher a level of agreeableness, and they want to please, and they want to do well, and they want to earn not just my approval, but the approval of the institution, et cetera. And you've almost got, maybe it's part of masculine psychology, is that you almost have to defeat the boys before they will follow you. That's right.
No, and that's the thing is, I think that's true. I actually recently was at a benefit, fundraiser dinner, and there was a band that played, comprised of teachers from a local all-male school, and the name of the band was revealing: No Late Work. And that's the reality here, is that I do think that there are, as I said, I think there are important signals in our society that males are, it's fair game to discriminate against males, except maybe in certain circumstances, maybe black males, in some way or something like that. But generally speaking, males are discriminated against. And I think the other part is, and I think I may have said this in response to one of your tweets, I think there's been a feminization of religion and education in this way. And maybe what you're talking about is one aspect of this. And it hasn't allowed boys to thrive because they do need that fighting. They do need to be defeated. They need to sense that. They won't always like it, but if you don't do it, they kind of wilt.
It's interesting thinking back about myself as a young student. The professors I most admired, and this is probably very kind of uniquely masculine.
Yeah.
The professors I most admired were also the professors who consistently made me feel dumb in public.
Yeah.
And so I've often wondered, like, why do no students raise their hands?
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with this, that when years ago when I was a college student or whatever, the situation was not quite what it is now. And I would raise my hand and challenge this guy who's had a PhD in philosophy for 28 years, and he would just shoot me down. But I was like, okay, well, let's wait and see what happens tomorrow. Right?
Yeah.
So that is how, like, a man gets motivated to do the reading.
Yeah. I would say for the last 10 years, guys, and I think even women have kind of shut down more because of this fear of being canceled. And they'll say, I don't want to offend anybody. You can get them to speak. And I think that's because there's actually there's not a freedom to argue. And I would say that probably changed around 2013, 2014 in a significant direction, where classes before that, I'd have these guys arguing about, in some cases, stupid points where you'd have to be like, okay, we're done talking about this, like this, but they'd want to win. And you'd be like, all right. But there isn't that sense of agonism that is acceptable, and you're not supposed to have that. And that's why I think, no conversation in the last decade can go without mentioning Trump, but that's why he's been such a lightning rod, because he too is an example of a kind of, in certain ways, an exaggerated, agonistic male who's willing to fight you and say stuff in your face and that sort of thing. And is some of it probably too much? Well, yeah, but it's also, the fact that he's willing to stand up and fight. And that's what people would say. That's why I think all these, Joe Rogan is another, right? I mean, why is he so cool? Well, he's able to talk for 3 hours about stuff in an objective way, even, and he's able to argue about things. And he's also, this guy in great shape who can, who's also like an MMA fighter.
Right.
And that kind of aggression is acceptable there. I noticed this, a few years ago, even kind of, left-wing, at least male colleagues at my former institution would be like, yeah, I listened to Joe Rogan. Because even though he was kind of on the left, that sort of style of masculinity was something that you had to kind of, keep on the down low, lest you get on the side of the feminists and those who don't like this.
All of this brings to mind an example from my own education. Looking back, when I was 19, I took a writing class with a professor I liked very much. And he had assigned us to do an 8 to 10 page paper focused on an individual I know and admire, or something like that. And I spent a lot of time working on that paper. But what I turned in was about a 25-page creative nonfiction project that was sprawling and et cetera. And I was really proud of it. And I got it back, and it had on the title page, huge C-.
Yep.
And so I went right to his office, and I held that in my hand, and I said, I am really disappointed in this grade. And he was sitting at his desk. I remember it so clearly. And he looked up at me, and he looked angry, and he said, so am I. Sit down.
Yeah.
And he proceeded to give me a lecture about the fact that you have writing talent does not give you the excuse to break the rules. You should have done the assignment I gave you.
Right. Yep.
And I think about that often as like one of the best moments of my education. Because, and maybe it's a masculine thing, but when he looked angry at me and told me to sit down, and I thought, I should never have come in here. Right? That's what went through my mind, is I should have just kept my mouth shut.
Yeah.
But he also was communicating to me care. Like,
that's right.
At the same time, like he's like telling me, you didn't pay attention, you didn't follow the rules. Why should I even have read this thing, and blah blah blah. Yeah. I also got like another level of real sense that this man cares about me.
Yeah.
And maybe that's like an experience that you can only have in like male single sex education.
That's right. I think I told you, but before the show, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work of Walter Ong, who is a Jesuit scholar, who wrote a book called "Fighting for Life" in the late 70s, and it was a kind of study of the differences between men and women. And I became acquainted with it because when I was editor of Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture, we got an article from a professor at St. Meinrad Seminary in Indiana, Father Christian Robb, a Benedictine, who wrote about Ong's vision. And this was the context for the article, is that there has been, perhaps for understandable reasons, a lot of focus on the gifts of women and the particular genius of women. And in Catholic circles, it's often referred to as the feminine genius. But there's been comparatively little focus on what it is about men that manifests a genius as well. And I think that's true as well, probably in evangelical circles. Aaron Wren's writing on this seems to manifest that, that sort of concern that men are always conceived of as, slightly inferior to women, and they have to sort of be exactly like women. And I thought that Ong and Robb's vision was exactly right in terms of saying that yes, there is a kind of genius, and it's manifest in biology and sort of sociology and psychology, whereby women are durable, women are receptive, they can embrace others, and women are interior. And all of those are good. All of those are represented by the Virgin Mary and by every saint in history. And, they do represent especially God's own interiority. But, Robb and Ong point out that, that men are expendable in certain ways, right? I mean, the man can die, but if that child is conceived, the child will go on. And that sort of leads to a certain sort of approach to things. Men are fighters. Why? Because it makes us expendable in a certain way. Men are, instead of being interiorly receptive, they are agonistic and they fight each other. And then, of course, men are, instead of being interior, we're exterior in almost every way. And I do think that, somebody like Andrew Tate, in a very distorted way, does manifest those aspects. There is a certain agonism. There's a sort of dangerousness, that recklessness, and there's an exteriority. There's a sort of objectivity. Now, it's all distorted in his vision, but it's all present there. Whereas I think all too often men are told that, no, you've got to be more interior. Stop being so exterior. Stop being, your men are bad because they come up with these schemes and they don't take into account the person. Men, you men are always fighting about things, and really we just want to have a dialogue, a conversation. I mean, and all of those things, I think the main point is we need to see that some of the, part of what makes a man good, and Jordan Peterson was right on about this, is that men are dangerous. They risk themselves, they risk they fight things, and they're focused on the outside world and building things outside themselves. I mean, I think you're right. There are people out there, but I do think that there is there's a sort of a vibe that infects Christianity in many ways, Catholic and Protestant, perhaps even Orthodox, that does sort of say, well, no, we all have to be, meek and gentle Jesus, but not Jesus who drives out dangers or or says these harsh things like, get thee behind me, Satan. So I think there's something positive out there, but it's got to be acknowledged as part of the dangerous side of masculinity. Something like you said that is manifest when men are together and are fighting each other.
Yes, and it's a whole bunch of things. Number one, it's very interesting on Twitter because I get a lot of young men who I think might want to fight with me, but who also have zero social skills. So all they can do is just insult. They don't really even know how to begin engaging in an argument. So that's part of what compounds it. And that I was the benefit of an education that valued arguing in the classroom, but I also very much remember that insults were off the table, and that if you insulted someone, you were considered the intellectual. That was a sign that you were a big loser.
Yeah,
because you didn't stick with the argument. And so part of what's happening is not just that boys have what you're calling this agonistic impulse. It's that they also have no training in what to do with it.
That's right. The exteriority, right? That sort of ability to sort of be objective and outside they need to have the tools with which to build, but also to fight properly and smartly. But I was never involved. We didn't have a debate team. But my impression from watching videos online of debate right now is that it's whoever can kind of shout the loudest, the quickest wins. And there's no sense of an intellectual debate anymore. It's more, bravado performance, which, I guess it has its place in certain ways, but it's certainly not the kind of, we want to be able to harness all of those gifts so that men can fight properly and can use that aggression in ways that are controlled and geared at something that's bigger than just winning, but is indeed winning for the truth or winning for the good.
That's the other thing I was going to say is that, and maybe there are people who don't grasp this, I don't know, but a lot of what creates that agonistic culture among men is conviction. It is this idea that I stand for something, and how important it is for a man's identity to think I stand for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of our problem too, so maybe that's what we're saying about Tate, is that while he gives permission to be agonistic, he also can't answer the question of what should I stand for.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
But the very idea that you would stand is itself, I think, impressive to people, because they're all too used to. I do think they're all too used to men just sort of giving way, and okay, all right, you can win. The women should win, and of course, that is proper sometimes. That the man lets the lady step forward, or I would like you to choose the, whatever. But but they see all too often that men just back down in the face of any sort of female desire. And I do think that that tends to be I mean, this is something that, like I say, this is not just in sort of Catholic circles, but Aaron Renn will talk about this in some of his writings on these topics, that, you know, the idea of sort of complementarian virtue for men is sort of like, you know, always thinking about your wife and giving way to whatever she wants. And, you know, that itself, you know, it bears truth too, but there's something distorted about that. That it's always, you know, that women should always be sort of allowed to get their own way. And if anything goes wrong, it's the man's fault. So, you know, I think they see that somebody like Tate says, you know, men are the ones who, you know, should back off. And although again, it's distorted, it responds to, I think, what they see as a lack, you know, in what they've been taught. And again, it's not a justification. I mean, you know, saying that somebody is motivated in part by something else doesn't justify the wrong thing, but it does give us a window into, well, how motivate young men. And a suggestion that, you know, we need the return of single-sex events, single-sex education is important. When I was in Minnesota, I was helping out with called the Argument of the Month Club. And it was an all-male group. And it was explicitly all-male because men can feel free to argue, sometimes yell at each other, but, you know, kind of go at each other. And it was incredibly successful for a long time. You know, it was kind of in certain ways a victory. It had some problems, and COVID kind of, you know, knocked us off. But it was incredibly successful because it was a place where you could have that sort of masculine ability to sort of argue with each other straight out. And I remember going to talk to some people, some women, about they wanted to start something similar. And, you know, I explained to them what we were doing and how we operated and how we would have debates that were sort of one-on-one or two-on-two. And they said this just, you know, I mean, it wasn't just that the kind of food and drink that we served wasn't to their taste necessarily, but it was that, you know, even the way we'd set it up to be very confrontational was not the way they wanted to approach it. And that was perfectly fine. But what we understood was, yeah, this is actually what's popular with men. And we'd have men driving from an hour or 2 hours away to participate in this thing, to talk about, well, you know, what should we think about immigration? Or, you know, should we give up on Catholic education? Or, you know, whatever the topic was. And that was okay. And that's why I do think we need the return of these single-sex events, single-sex spaces where men can have the ability to actually argue in a way that they wouldn't do when their wives or the women in their life are around, or women at all. So I think that this is really an important thing to have you know, healthy examples of that in men-only spaces, but where it is directed towards something bigger than themselves. And that's where I think there's, you know, this is the danger, right? Is that men's agonism can just simply become dominance and violence. And I think we've seen that with Andrew Tate. The exteriority can become a sort of a blithe indifference to others. But there is also something good about these things, that men can be, you know, brutally frank and objective about things. And they can say, look, we've got to make a solution, and this has got to work this way. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but for a long time, Gallup, for like 60 years, did a poll on who would you rather have as a boss, a man or a woman? And, you know, as you might guess, most people said, well, it kind of depends on who it is. But what was interesting about it is that of those who said they preferred, you know, one or the other, it was primarily women, and it was primarily women saying, I'd rather have a man. Right? Well, why? Because I do think that there is a certain sort of objectivity, and we're going to set up exterior rules, and we're going to be, we're going to be safe. Because the problem with women is that by being interior and receptive and kind of ordered to the individual, women can tend to set up a situation where there's sort of it depends on whether she likes you, whether you're going to be held to the rule or not. And that sort of masculine say, no, this is the rule, this is what we're doing, is a real gift. Does it need to be tempered? Maybe sometimes, but a lot of times it's actually what saves situations.
Yes, I think all of that is correct. Now, I would also want to say about the value of single sex spaces for men, that only in those situations does the real hierarchy emerge. And that young men need to be there because part of their problem is that they aren't, that in a sort of a mixed sex kind of classroom, for example, they really aren't on the bottom. That's part of the reason why they're so indifferent to their studies, is that they're not on the bottom of anything. Yeah. Right? They're everyone's kind of on this equal plane, and so who cares? But if they knew they were on the when you are a man and you are on the bottom, then you have a lot of motivation to care.
Yeah.
Okay. And also you have opportunity to have fun by challenging the guys the next level up. Or maybe you can skip a level and challenge the guy at the very top.
Yep.
Okay. And that's fun. And guys higher up need to have the experience of caring for the guys lower down. And I think, and maybe a lot of people now, to even talk about that kind of hierarchy, the guy at the top, the guys higher up, the guys at the bottom, is they can only hear that concept as a concept that has no compassion. But if you've had experience in all male environments, it becomes very clear that no, this is how compassion is manufactured. And that in fact that the guys at the bottom have a lot more freedom in some ways than the guys at the top.
Yep.
So the guys at the bottom are free, for example, to make fun of the guys higher up. They're able to make jokes about them. Like if you are in an all male classroom and you're a student, you can kind of do an impression of the professor, tease the professor, whatever, in a way that he can never do to you, because it would be a violation of the rule, of the unspoken rules, that the stronger doesn't hurt the weaker, in a way.
Yeah.
And that's part of the way that men learn to have compassion for each other, is by taking that responsibility as you move up the hierarchy, taking responsibility for the people who are lower down in it than you are.
Yeah.
And when guys don't have that, that's when I think that their natural agonism becomes Tate-like.
Yep.
And because they didn't go through a process where essentially the worst impulses of that were at least metaphorically beaten out of them. Do you know what I'm saying? Which is the role of the guys up at the top.
Yep. But see, think about that. I mean, and you see this in like old stories about, schools, like, the competition to get the highest score. Now that would never happen because, in college, FERPA laws would, how dare you, you could never make anything public. And the whole system is set up such that competition is at least ostensibly put down. No, we're just in favor of cooperation. And so that you get, and this is what I think people do mean by the longhouse, is that, you have these sorts of rivalries, but they're interior, they're secret. Nobody quite knows how they're decided. Mm-hmm. And men are like, you tell me, like, as you say, you tell me like I'm going to jump to the next level. They'll be like, all right, yeah, I'll take you on. But when it's kind of a hidden system, I do think men, just sort of go, it's not even worth it. I mean, who knows? And I mean, look, frankly, I mean, I know that I myself didn't get one job because people on the inside told me that, well, no, they said that they had to hire a woman for this one. Even though I think I was the better candidate, that's it. But that's how men have been sort of trained and taught these days, is to know that, well, it doesn't really matter whether you're the best or not. We're going to decide it on some other grounds. And so I think men have a tendency to say, to hell with it.
Right. I think the other thing to say about our current situation, and I feel like this is true for a lot of boys, is that there is what understanding of masculinity they do have is so narrowed because they just don't know enough history. Yeah. So it's hard for them to so for example, the boy who wants to write poetry, I mean, somehow somehow poetry becomes female coded. Right. And it's female coded in his mind because he doesn't know Longfellow. He doesn't know Shakespeare. He doesn't know Milton or Dante or any of the other male poets up through the years who have dominated that field. Yep. Not to say there haven't been outstanding female poets, but there have certainly been enough great male poets that boys should be taught that something innately human like poetry is not female coded. And so what happens is a lot of boys sort of get given this now restricted vision of masculinity that excludes the arts. It excludes almost everything but sports, really. Yeah. And so a lot of guys who aren't sporty just drop out of their own sort of just basically disown their own masculine urge to do what they're called to do or meant to do.
I think it's a great gift that at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, we have a very successful Master of Fine Arts program in writing. And it's, right now I think they have designs to expand it to other forms of writing, but right now it's primarily focused on fiction and poetry. And the founders are both men. And although I think probably the women students dominate the population, nevertheless, I think that's in part because you have two men saying, "Hey, yeah, this is good stuff." Yeah. And the poet James Matthew Wilson is somebody who is a kind of a formalist and believes in tradition and believes that poetry is not just sort of arranging words on a page in some sort of strange fashion, but no, there are rules about how to make a good rhyme and to have a good rhythm. And if you learn these, right, you can write great poetry too. And I think that's a great help to men, is to have those avenues opened up again.
Speaking of that, I should just note that in an upcoming episode of the Dean Abbott podcast, I think there's going to be an interview with Joshua Wren, who is one of the men you're talking about.
That's right.
Yes, and so I think all of that, but it's such an interesting thing when you're talking about James Matthew Wilson and his emphasis on formalism. I, who am a proponent and an appreciator of free verse, I instantly feel that we need to have an argument about this.
I was going to say, you need to have James on too to have the argument.
Right.
Yeah.
But the point is that I immediately responded to that as a man with no. And that is exactly an example of what I'm talking about, right? That young boys, they don't even know enough to know that throughout, say, the 20th century, male poets fought with each other over things like formalism versus free verse, etc.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting, Eliot not exactly a formalist.
No.
But do you know that C.S. Lewis hated T.S. Eliot's poems?
Oh, yeah.
And they had a little bit of a public feud for a while.
Yes.
And that's a good example, too, of what we're talking about. This kind of thing.
They did get back together because they worked together on revisions to the Psalter.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually, they found they liked each other despite the earlier feud, but they weren't afraid to have those arguments. I mean, you bring up Lewis. There's another person. I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien. It was that relationship that is in large part responsible for the Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. Because Tolkien kind of thought, I'm kind of doing this, but it's not, I don't know if this is worth anything. And Lewis kept bugging him. No, this is good. Keep going with this. Keep going with this. And even amid the Inklings, that was not universal either. I mean, there's a famous story about, one of them seeing Tolkien shuffling in with his papers and saying, not another blanking elf. But those guys fought with each other over these ideas. And Tolkien actually didn't really respond the same to Lewis about his own fictional attempts. He was largely critical of them.
Right.
But it was out of that mixture that, boy, you created something that was really great artistically. But I can't imagine, a female Inklings, if you will, operating in the same manner. Right. I could imagine a female group of writers who got together, but they wouldn't be the same.
Right.
And that's okay.
It was rough. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, what's the upshot?
I think the upshot is this, that we don't have to say, well, it's okay, Andrew Tate's just fine. But I do think that we have to successfully inculcate in young males that, this dangerous side of masculinity is definitely a part of what it is to be a male. But it has to be harnessed in certain ways so that it can actually be good for others. But we don't want to quash the desire to fight, but we want to harness and say, when do you fight? How do you fight? Right? What are you fighting for? We don't want to quash, that tendency to be exterior and logical and that sort of thing. But we want to say, okay, how do you do that? Right. But also take into account, these sort of feminine virtues of adapting to the individual. Mm-hmm. I think that, how do you fit in these virtues and not deny them, but harness them? And I think when we get good examples of these, I think fewer men will go that way. But we can't be, pie in the sky people. There will always be people who are attracted to deranged forms of everything. I think you and I have talked about this, that a lot of this sort of manosphere stuff is almost like the mirror image of the worst kinds of feminist things. It's just that, now we're going to applaud sort of destructive distortions on this side rather than this side. Mm-hmm. And the key thing is to say, what's there to save? When I taught a course on men and women in Minnesota, I would assign articles like Claudia Card's Against Marriage and Motherhood and lots of other stuff that was sort of in that vein. But I would always make the students say, okay, because some of them would say, this stuff's crazy. And I'd say, yeah, but I agree with you. But let's step back a second and figure out what in here, is the author trying to protect, to conserve, to advance. And then when we figure that out, let's figure out how we can respond and say, hey, you're right about that, but you can't get there from here. Let's go a different path. And I think that's what we have to do with the dangerous side of masculinity. Jordan Peterson has shown us a certain way. I think other people, you mentioned Matt Fradd, I think they've shown us that way too. We just need to have more of them, and they have to be, in a certain way, able to influence discussions more. They have to be more men teaching, I think, and perhaps more single-sex education, or at least single-sex aspects to education, in order to get men to be able to learn how to harness that stuff and develop it. That's my upshot.
Very good. Tell people how they can find you if they want to find out more online again one more time.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or X at David P. Deavel. And you can see my work. I write regularly for theimaginative-conservative.com and AMAC Newsline. So, and other places as well. But those are my kind of regular publication places.
All right. Thanks again for doing this. We'll do it again soon.
Hey, thank you, Dean.
No problem.